The nurse looked at her screen, then back at me, then back at her screen again. "I'm sorry," she said, "but your insurance shows as terminated. 8 months ago." I was doubled over in a hospital bed with what would turn out to be a ruptured appendix. And the first coherent thought I had, underneath the pain, was that my husband had been paying that premium out of our joint account every single month since. Or at least, I'd believed he had. I didn't understand yet that the money hadn't stopped going toward health insurance at all. It had simply stopped going toward mine. But to understand how a hospital billing error uncovered something far larger than a lapsed policy, you need to know what my life actually looked like in the 8 months before that emergency room visit. My name is Dana Whitmore. I'm 36, and for the past 11 years, I've run a small freelance graphic design business from home. The kind of self-employment that comes with real creative freedom and essentially no benefits of its own. My husband, Greg, worked as a regional sales director for a mid-sized industrial equipment company, a job that came with solid, dependable health coverage. Coverage I'd been enrolled in as his spouse since almost the beginning of our 12-year marriage. I want to be honest that our marriage, for most of those 12 years, felt entirely ordinary in the best possible sense. Comfortable, occasionally distant the way long marriages sometimes become, but fundamentally stable. Greg traveled frequently for work, covering a sales territory that spanned 3 states, sometimes gone 8 to 10 days at a stretch, a travel schedule that had simply become the normal rhythm of our life together. I never had reason to question that travel schedule closely. Greg's job genuinely did require it, verifiably through years of company emails, expense reports, and colleagues I'd met at company events who could confirm his territory and his travel demands were entirely real. The appendicitis hit on an ordinary Tuesday evening, sudden and severe enough that a neighbor drove me to the emergency room while Greg was traveling, 3 states away on what he'd told me was a routine client visit. I called him from the waiting room. He said he'd try to get an earlier flight back, though he sounded, even through the pain fog I was in, oddly distracted on the phone in a way I didn't have the capacity to examine closely at the time. The insurance denial came up during intake, before I'd even been fully admitted. I remember the confusion more clearly than the physical pain in some ways, because it made no sense against everything I understood about our finances. I could see on our joint banking app right there in the waiting room a monthly deduction still leaving our account under a line item labeled Benefits, Payroll. The money was clearly still being taken. It simply, according to the hospital's system, wasn't going toward covering me anymore. I want to walk through what happened over the following 48 hours, because the timeline matters enormously for understanding what I eventually uncovered. The hospital, unable to verify active coverage, required a substantial upfront payment before proceeding with what was, by that point, an urgent surgical situation. I paid it from our joint savings, frightened and confused, while continuing to try Greg's phone every 20 minutes. He finally called back nearly 6 hours after my initial message, apologetic, vague, explaining that there had likely been some kind of processing error with HR, and that he'd sorted out the moment he landed. Something in his tone, even through my exhaustion and lingering anesthesia fog after surgery, struck me as rehearsed rather than genuinely confused. I didn't have the energy to examine that feeling closely yet. I simply filed it away. Greg returned home 2 days after my surgery, 3 days later than his original travel schedule had suggested. Another detail I noticed but didn't yet have the clarity to question directly. He was solicitous, attentive, bringing flowers and taking time off work to help me recover. Behavior that, looking back, feels almost like overcorrection now, though at the time it simply read as genuine care. The insurance issue, he told me, had been resolved, a system glitch HR had corrected, and I would be reinstated retroactively so the hospital bill would eventually be covered. I want to be honest that I believed this initially, largely because I had no reason yet to disbelieve it, and because I was, frankly, too physically depleted in those first 2 weeks of recovery to pursue it more aggressively myself. The hospital's billing department, however, pursued it considerably more aggressively than I did. 3 weeks after my surgery, I received a call from a hospital billing coordinator named Patricia, informing me that in processing my retroactive coverage claim, they'd discovered something unusual in Greg's employer's benefit system that they needed me to be aware of before they could proceed further. Patricia explained, carefully and somewhat delicately, that Greg's employer-provided health plan showed a change of dependent spouse 8 months earlier, removing me and adding a different individual as his covered spouse, under a different last name, at an address in a different state entirely, one I had never once visited or heard mentioned in 12 years of marriage. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, still recovering, still on pain medication, trying to process a sentence that simply didn't fit into any version of my life I understood. I want to be honest about the next several days, because I didn't handle them with the composed clarity I might present if I were embellishing this story. I confronted Greg immediately, and he initially denied it entirely, insisting Patricia had made some kind of clerical error, growing increasingly agitated as I pressed for specifics he clearly hadn't expected to need to produce. It was only when I told him, calmly, that I intended to call his employer's HR department directly the following morning to clarify the situation myself, that his composure finally fully collapsed. What Greg told me that night, in pieces, over several hours, reframed 12 years of marriage into something I am still, honestly, working through the full weight of. For the past 6 years, Greg had been maintaining what amounted to an entirely separate second household, 2 states away, well within his regular sales territory, with a woman named Carla Reyes. Carla, according to what Greg eventually admitted, believed herself to be legally married to him. I want to pause here, because this is the detail that took the situation from painful betrayal into something with far more serious legal weight. Greg had, 4 years into his relationship with Carla, obtained a marriage license and married her in that state, presenting her with documentation claiming he had divorced me 2 years earlier. That divorce had never actually happened. I had never been served with divorce papers, never signed anything, never appeared in any court proceeding of any kind. Because no such proceeding had ever been filed, Greg had, in other words, committed bigamy, using forged or fabricated documentation to convince Carla that he was legally free to marry her, while remaining fully, legally married to me the entire time. Carla and Greg had 2 young children together, ages 4 and 2, both born during a period when Greg remained, unbeknownst to either Carla or myself, still legally married to another woman entirely. I want to be honest about the strange, dissociated calm that settled over me somewhere in the middle of this conversation. The pain of 12 years of ordinary marriage revealing itself as a cover for an entirely separate life was in some ways too large to process emotionally in real time. Instead, something clinical took over, the same instinct, I imagine, that makes people suddenly capable of handling a crisis with steady hands, even while everything underneath is falling apart. The insurance cancellation, it turned out, had been a simple, careless miscalculation on Greg's part, rather than a deliberate attempt to harm me specifically. 8 months earlier, he'd needed to add Carla as his covered spouse to secure health coverage for their second child's upcoming birth, and in the administrative process of doing so through his employer's benefits portal, had simply removed my name as his listed spouse to make room for hers, apparently believing, in the moment, that he could quietly correct my coverage separately. Before I ever noticed the gap, he hadn't accounted for a ruptured appendix arriving before he got around to fixing that oversight. Contacted a family law attorney the following week, along with, separately, a criminal defense attorney Greg would eventually need to retain of his own, once it became clear that bigamy, along with the fraudulent divorce documentation he'd presented to Carla and to the state where their marriage license was filed, carried serious legal consequences well beyond our own marriage's dissolution. My attorney explained, clearly, that because Greg's marriage to me had never been legally dissolved, his subsequent marriage to Carla was void from its inception, meaning Carla, through no fault of her own, had never actually been legally married to him at all, despite 6 years and 2 children built around believing otherwise. I want to be honest about something complicated here. I felt, surprisingly, very little anger toward Carla once the full picture became clear. She had been deceived just as thoroughly as I had, in some ways more severely, having built an entire family structure around a legal status that had never actually existed. We spoke once, briefly, by phone, both of us still processing the same betrayal from two very different vantage points. It was not a warm conversation, but it was not an adversarial one either. Two people, deceived by the same man, trying to understand the shape of what had actually happened to both of our lives simultaneously. The financial and legal unwinding that followed took the better part of a year. Because Greg's marriage to me remained the only legally valid one throughout, our actual divorce proceeded as a conventional 12-year marriage dissolution, with marital assets, including significant retirement accounts and property Greg had, it turned out, been quietly building with joint funds while also secretly supporting an entirely separate household, divided according to standard marital property law. Separately, Greg faced criminal exposure for bigamy and for the fraudulent divorce documentation he'd fabricated, charges that, according to my attorney, carried real potential for both fines and jail time, depending on how aggressively the state chose to pursue the case, particularly once the employer benefits fraud. Having incorrectly claimed a legally married spouse for insurance purposes while still married to someone else came into consideration as well. Greg ultimately reached a plea arrangement that included probation, mandatory restitution covering both my hospital bill and a portion of the benefits fraud his employer had suffered, and a permanent record that ended his career in his existing industry entirely. Once his employer, upon learning the full details, terminated him for cause, Carla, I understand secondhand, relocated with their 2 children and has pursued her own separate legal claims against Greg for child support and damages related to the fraud he perpetrated against her specifically. Entirely independent of my own case, I settled my hospital bill, once Greg's plea agreement included restitution covering it directly, and used a portion of the divorce settlement to do something I think mattered more to my recovery than the money itself. I worked with a local nonprofit that helps self-employed and freelance workers navigate health insurance options independent of spousal coverage, something I wish desperately I had prioritized years earlier. Rather than allowing my own healthcare access to remain entirely dependent on a marriage I believed, wrongly, was built on complete honesty. I think about that appendicitis often, strange as it sounds, with something approaching gratitude rather than only pain. If it hadn't happened, if that insurance gap hadn't collided directly with a genuine medical emergency, I don't know how much longer an entirely separate life, 2 states away, 2 children deep, might have continued running quietly alongside my own, undiscovered. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive through suspicion or careful investigation. Sometimes it arrives because your body forces a crisis at exactly the moment. Someone else's carelessness finally catches up with them. If you've made it this far with me, do you think Carla suspected anything before this came out? Or do you think Greg was simply that thorough in keeping both lives completely separate? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this one matter to you, make sure you're subscribed to Justice Unfolds, because every story here has a reckoning.